The NBA has changed a lot over the years, and with massive TV deals and with the game being as global as it is today, it's hard to envision a time where the league was in danger of dying completely. But that was the reality the NBA was in the 1970s. In an attempt to create more interest in the product, the two fiercely competitive leagues, the ABA and the NBA, merged together in 1976. And although it did raise the level of interest in the league temporarily, it was only a matter of time before it fizzled out completely. You see, the league's popularity was hindered by a multitude of issues in the late 70s. For one, racial tension was a major issue, as some players and styles were not fully embraced by the general audience. The contrasting styles of the ABA players and the NBA players were not conducive to a united basketball fandom at that time, as NBA fans preferred more of a fundamental and traditional approach, while ABA fans enjoyed the more flashy and modern aspects of the evolving game. Beyond that, harmful substances were basically everywhere throughout the league, which not only affected the game's image, but even the product on the court, as many players were not on their best behavior, and on-court fighting was nearly a nightly occurrence. Then begins the 1979 to 1980 season, where Magic Johnson and Larry Bird made their debut into the league. In future videos, I'll talk more about Bird's role in all of this, but this one is focused specifically on Magic and Showtime. What Earvin Magic Johnson brought to the game was just that, magic. Unlike the perception of the league throughout the late 70s, Magic was the definition of class, mixed with the shine of Hollywood showmanship. He was dazzling and incredibly skilled, but he always did it with a smile on his face. Magic's supreme confidence, charisma, and charm was exactly what the league desperately needed, and he didn't waste any time becoming the face of the league, as he famously won the NBA championship and the Finals MVP in just his rookie season. One of the most underrated aspects of Magic's character was his humble leadership. Unlike Shaq and Kobe of the 2000s, Magic was quick to tell his co-star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar that it was his team, and Magic would publicly make that claim in interviews as well. Kareem was known as the captain and Magic was known as Magic, and both players were content and thrived in those roles. Magic's leadership was contagious, and as an old mentor once told me, groups take on the image of their leader, and this was certainly the case for Magic and the Lakers, as they fed off of his enthusiasm, energy, and competitive drive. Not only did Magic want to constantly push the tempo, but his teammates embraced that style and excelled in it, as players like James Worthy and Byron Scott learned to acclimate their games to perfectly suit Magic's style. Thus, Showtime was born, an amazing and dazzling product that had the flair and fast-paced action of a Hollywood thriller. It was a unique time in the league, as one specific player wasn't the hottest ticket in sports, but rather it was the entire offense that emphasized teamwork, speed, and efficiency. Thanks to their brilliance and thanks to their legendary rivalry with the very different Boston Celtics, the league's ratings skyrocketed to an extent that pro basketball had never seen before. Not only was the Showtime era the most important time in Lakers franchise history, but they've also become a symbol and the standard of what basketball should be and is meant to be. Anytime a team executes teamwork in transition with precision and excellence, everybody is quick to call it Showtime. Teams, coaches, and players have been striving to emulate that same level of excellence, dominance, and entertainment for decades at this point. And I think it's fair to say that none of them have ever pulled it off completely. That is how the Showtime Lakers played the majority role in saving the NBA, and that is how they will always be honored and remembered.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, formerly known as Lou Alcindor before he changed his name in 1971. Kareem has a strong and extensive case to be the NBA's greatest player of all time. He's the NBA's all-time leading scorer with over 38,000 points, 6 MVPs, and 6 NBA championships. He was one of the best scorers year in and year out. He was an elite defender with 11 all-defense team selections. He was an elite rebounder and was known as the captain during the Lakers' dynasty days of the 1980s. Unfortunately, Kareem very rarely receives the credit he deserves when discussing the greatest players of all time. Despite his otherworldly production, Kareem had a very modest personality. Magic Johnson was the flashy, charismatic one with the fast break and the no-look passes, while Kareem was slower paced, more about fundamentals and routine. Many, including myself, strongly believe this is the reason Kareem rarely gets his well-deserved shine. It's the same reason everyone wants to talk about Kobe and his 5 championships, but no one wants to talk about Tim Duncan and his 5 championships. It's because one had a flashy personality and a flashy game, while the other was the quiet but reliable type. We simply don't praise both styles of players equally. Magic, Kareem, Kobe, and Tim Duncan will all produce on a regular basis, but it's Kobe and Magic who make the highlight reels, while Kareem's skyhook and Duncan's bank shots only show up on the stat sheet. Kareem was so incredibly overlooked that even the Lakers organization failed to show him his respect before they were prompted to do so. In May of 2011, the Lakers had already built statues outside of the Staples Center of Magic Johnson, Jerry West, Chick Hearn, Oscar De La Hoya, and Wayne Gretzky. Those were all well-deserved, but the lack of Kareem getting his own statue more than 20 years after his retirement was one of the biggest oversights in Lakers history. It was in May of 2011 that Kareem shared his strong feelings on the matter when he said, "I don't understand it. It's either an oversight or they're taking me for granted. I'm not going to try to read people's minds, but it doesn't make me happy. It's definitely a slight. I feel slighted." It was soon afterwards the Lakers finally made a statue in Kareem's honor. Despite the oversights of Kareem's prestigious career, he was GOAT quality from the instant he entered the NBA. As a rookie, he improved the Bucks by 29 wins while averaging 29 points and 15 rebounds. Take a second to ponder what I just said. Imagine a player in today's day entering the NBA as a rookie, improving his team by 29 games and averaging 29 and 15. In only his sophomore season, Kareem was averaging 31 points and 16 rebounds and led the Bucks to win 66 games. His second year in the league was impressive enough for him to secure the first of 6 MVP awards. That season, they went on to the NBA Finals and swept the Baltimore Bullets, which resulted in a Finals MVP for Kareem. By the end of only his second season in the NBA, Kareem was an MVP and Finals MVP who averaged 31 and 16. By 1975, Kareem was ready to move on from Milwaukee and demanded a trade to either the LA Lakers or the New York Knicks. He was then traded to the Lakers, and it was then that he began the half of his career that he's most remembered for. In his first season with the Lakers in the 1975-76 season, Kareem had one of the greatest single seasons of NBA history. He averaged 27.7 points, 16.9 rebounds, and a monstrous 4.1 blocks per game. His total of 1,111 defensive rebounds that season is an NBA record that still stands more than 4 decades later. His season was so impressive that he was named MVP of the league that year, despite the fact that the Lakers didn't even make the playoffs. Kareem would continue to be the staple of consistency as him and Magic dominated the NBA throughout the 1980s. Something to remember about Kareem is that he was the perfect center to be paired with Magic Johnson. When choosing your all-time starting 5, if Magic is your point guard, then you must certainly take Kareem at the center position, because Magic loved to run the fast break and push the tempo, and very few centers in NBA history could run the floor with Magic as well as Kareem did. Kareem's skyhook was arguably the most indefensible shot in NBA history. I mean, think about it this way. Every time Kareem was in the post with his back to the basket, his defender knew what was coming. We all did. And yet there was still absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. You had a player who was 7 foot 2 inches tall, who had a 7 foot 5 inch wingspan, who could leap like he was taking a jump shot and would put the ball sky high in the air before flicking his wrist for an almost certain 2 points. Also consider the fact that his non-shooting shoulder was facing the defender, meaning the defensive player would have to try to go across Kareem's body just to contest the shot. This is why the skyhook is the most indefensible shot in NBA history. Honestly, one of the biggest travesties of the modern NBA is that no centers are taking the time to learn the skyhook. But it is an incredibly difficult shot to learn, and a technique that Kareem practiced since he was only 9 years old. Kareem may have been the hardest player to guard that there's ever been. He won more MVP awards than any player in NBA history, and he won 6 NBA championships. This is why Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is the greatest player of all time. Earvin Magic Johnson, recognized by most as the greatest point guard of NBA history. He was a 12-time All-Star, he made 10 All-NBA teams, he was a 3-time League MVP, 3-time Finals MVP, and a 5-time NBA champion. Magic was known for his remarkable leadership and his extremely unselfish approach to the game. He has the greatest assists per game average in NBA history at 11.2, ahead of John Stockton. Besides Magic and Stockton, no other player in NBA history averaged 10 assists or more for his career. He was just so far ahead of his time. He was a 6'9" giant point guard with the greatest court vision imaginable, who always wanted to push the tempo the instant his Lakers secured the rebound. Earvin Johnson was his birth name, but he earned the name Magic with his incredibly fast, flashy, and mesmerizing style of play. Magic is the definition of a player who makes his teammates better. Every teammate on the court had to be alert at all times because you never knew when Magic would find you, creating an easy scoring opportunity for you. I've actually seen people online criticize Magic for averaging just short of 20 points per game over his career, which to me is a silly criticism, considering that Magic has easily the highest assist per game average of all time. Of the top 10 players with the highest assist per game average in NBA history, Magic has the second highest scoring average among those players, behind only Oscar Robertson. Magic was also a clutch performer. Sure, he had his shortcomings and briefly had the nickname Tragic Johnson for his failures in the 1984 NBA Finals, but he easily redeemed himself from that, and beyond all of that are all the historic clutch moments and game winners of his career. From the baby skyhook in the 1987 Finals to his performance in the 1980 Finals. Speaking of the 1980 NBA Finals, if LeBron thinks that one significant series is enough to make his claim as the GOAT, then Magic has this one game to make his claim as the GOAT. Magic Johnson's rookie season was incredible. As a rookie, he averaged 18 points, over 7 rebounds, and 7 assists. It wasn't his numbers that made this season so legendary though, it was what he did on the NBA's biggest stage. I'm sure most of you know this story already, but the Lakers were in a hard-fought NBA Finals against the talented Julius Erving-led Philadelphia 76ers. In Game 5 of the NBA Finals, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar sprained his ankle and would not play again for the rest of the series. The Lakers were shorthanded and decided to start Magic Johnson at center for the 6th game of the series. Wrap your head around this for a second. Magic was the Lakers' starting point guard throughout the season, and as a 20-year-old rookie, he was tasked with starting in place of the great Kareem at center. What Magic did next sounds like it came straight from an over-the-top sports movie script. Magic dominated the game, playing at the center, forward, and guard positions at different points in the game based on whatever the Lakers needed on their lineup situations. The Lakers won the game 123-107, and Magic's final stat line was 42 points, 15 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 steals. It was the definition of a clutch performance. Magic is still the only rookie in NBA history to win the Finals MVP award. Magic is also one of only 4 players to win the NCAA championship and the NBA championship in consecutive years. Imagine any rookie in this year's draft class doing what Magic did, starting the year as a perimeter player and then stepping in at center in the clinching Game 6 of the NBA Finals, dropping 42, 15, and 7. the internet would explode, and media would be declaring him the next GOAT before he's even played a game in his sophomore season. It sounds impossible to even fathom, but that's what Magic Johnson did before many of us were even born to appreciate it. This was just the beginning of Magic's illustrious career and of his dominance over the NBA. Magic played in only 12 seasons in the NBA before he announced his retirement due to the HIV virus he obtained. Magic Johnson went to the NBA Finals in 9 of those 12 seasons in the league. That is astonishingly efficient. He can easily be seen as the standard of NBA excellence due to this. How many other legends can say that they led their team to the finals 75% of the time in their career? Even Jordan, LeBron, and Kobe aren't even close to that level of efficiency. Magic, unfortunately, doesn't have longevity working in his favor. His all-time statistics were cut short, along with his achievements and accolades. Yet despite all of that, Magic still put a GOAT-worthy resume together in the short time he was in the NBA. When Magic's career came to an abrupt end because of the HIV virus, he was still an MVP candidate and still far from the end of his elite status. He was only 31 years old. He was at his career average of almost 20 points a game. He was second in the league in assists at 12.5 per game. He was a back-to-back MVP winner just a year prior, and he just led his Lakers to the NBA Finals only 2 seasons after the retirement of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Magic wasn't just great when his career was cut short, he was likely still the best point guard in the game and a top 3 player in the league. To further drive home the point, I want you to imagine if other NBA legends had their careers cut short as early as Magic's was, and think of how that affects their legacies. Dirk Nowitzki would no longer be an NBA champion. LeBron James would never have won his amazing championship in Cleveland. Shaq would have 3 titles instead of 4, Duncan would have 4 titles instead of 5, and Michael Jordan would have only 3 titles instead of 6. Beyond just all of the lost championships are all of the lost stats, MVPs, All-NBA appearances, and just accolades overall. There was truly a second half of Magic's career that unfortunately we never got to witness. No one ever talks about this aspect, but imagine if Magic never got HIV and had a career that lasted as long as other legends like Kobe, Duncan, Kareem, or LeBron, just to name a few. If that had been the case, Magic could have spent his final few years of his career playing alongside of a young Shaq and Kobe. Are you kidding me? I understand that in all of these what-if scenarios, there's the whole butterfly effect, and that if this what-if actually happened, it could have changed the entire league as we know it with all of its ramifications. With that being said, Shaq signed with the Lakers in free agency. That's still something that could have easily happened even if Magic Johnson was around. Kobe also wasn't drafted by the Lakers, so draft position didn't really matter. He was scouted by the brilliant Jerry West, who fell in love with the young prospect and traded for Kobe. Even with Magic Johnson still around in the twilight of his career, both of those moves could have still easily taken place. How does this change Magic's legacy if he's adding titles alongside of Kobe and Shaq to end his career? Now let me be clear, I'm not saying we should give credit to Magic for stuff that didn't actually happen, but what I am doing is trying to show the impact that longevity can have on a player's career and legacy. I'm also trying to bring an appreciation to what Magic was able to accomplish in far less time than just about every other legend of NBA history. If you want a player who's the definition of making his teammates better, Magic Johnson is your choice. If you want a legend who's leading his team to be title contenders for his entire career, then Magic is your guy. If you want a GOAT who saved the NBA, changed the way the game is played, and put on a show while doing it, then Magic Johnson is the man you're looking for. This is why Magic Johnson is the greatest player of all time. Lately, I've been hearing a lot of people discussing and comparing the greatest NBA duos of all time. Shaq always loves bringing up this conversation on social media, which makes sense because he thinks him and Kobe were the best duo. Most people think it was Jordan and Pippen, and then some people will bring up Magic and Kareem. But honestly, the suggestion of them always bothered me a little bit, because the majority of Kareem and Magic's time together, they were not simply a duo, they were a trio. The third overlooked and disregarded superstar in that trio was Big Game James Worthy. But just how good was he really? Well, let's start by taking it back to the beginning of his career. Thanks to a trade the Lakers had made several years earlier, they had the first overall pick in the 1982 NBA draft, and with it, they took James Worthy from the University of North Carolina. He was a skilled 6'9" small forward who was quick and aggressive and often was on the receiving end of a Magic Johnson-led fast break. The high-octane, fast-paced, Showtime offense of the 80s Lakers, together with the fast slasher that is James Worthy, was basically a match made in heaven. He still had some growing to do though, and he spent his rookie season coming off of the bench providing an offensive spark for Los Angeles. In that first season, he averaged 13.4 points, 5.2 rebounds, 1.7 assists, and 1.2 steals on an extremely efficient 57.9% shooting. Efficiency would be a theme of Worthy's career throughout. He didn't take many shots from a great distance, and he rarely took any stupid or highly contested shots. He was smart with a high offensive IQ who relied on either the fast break or his low post game in half-court sets. He was another one of those fundamentally sound legends who possessed fantastic footwork. You just don't hear people bring it up much. In Worthy's first 2 seasons with the Lakers, they lost in the NBA Finals to the 76ers and the Boston Celtics. But it was his 3rd year in the league where James really began to break out and make a name for himself. And in turn, the Lakers were ready to make the most of it. As a 23-year-old, he had secured his place as the Lakers' starting small forward, and the Lakers dominated, finishing with a 62-20 record for the best record in the Western Conference. It was his best season yet, behind averages of 17.6 points, 6.4 rebounds, and 2.5 assists on 57.2% shooting. His regular season was pretty good, but he earned his Big Game James nickname in the 1985 playoffs. He thrived in that postseason, averaging 21.5 points, 5.1 rebounds, and 2.1 assists on a remarkable 62.3% shooting, almost unprecedented efficiency coming from a small forward. After their victory over the Celtics in 6 games, he was an NBA champion and had established himself as one of the clutch performers of the league. This would be just the start though. His next season would be his first of 7 straight All-Star seasons. Over that period of time, James would average 20.3 points, 5.3 rebounds, and 3.5 assists on 52.7% shooting. He was quite often the second and sometimes the first scoring option for the Lakers during that stretch. He continued the trend of being a great player, but in the playoffs, he consistently went from being simply a great player to an all-time great player. There's no shortage of epic postseason performances, like Game 3 of the 1987 Western Conference Finals against the Supersonics, where he dropped 39 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists on 64% shooting, which was good enough to get the Lakers a 1-point victory. Over that entire 1987 Western Conference Finals, he averaged 30.5 points on 60% shooting, and no other Laker averaged above 20 points. Even in seasons where they came up short, he still played like a monster, like in Game 4 of the 1989 NBA Finals against the Pistons. Byron Scott and Magic Johnson were out due to injuries, and James rose to the occasion, scoring 40 points on 65% shooting in a heroic effort. His defining moment, though, came in the 1988 NBA Finals. This was the Lakers' 5th and final championship run of the 1980s, and it would be a hard-fought 7-game series against the Bad Boys of Detroit, led by Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, and Bill Laimbeer. The final 2 games of this series would be decided by 1 basket, and the Laker who shined brightest in the most crucial games of their season was not the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, it was not the face of Showtime, Magic Johnson, it was the overlooked member of the dynamic trio, Big Game James Worthy. In Game 6, James was the Lakers' leading scorer, putting up 28 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists on 54% shooting. In Game 7, he took it to the next level, and he absolutely had to, as he played one of the greatest Game 7s in NBA history, dropping 36 points, 16 rebounds, and 10 assists on 68% shooting. The Lakers needed every single one of those statistics to win the deciding game by just 3 points. I think it goes without saying that Big Game James is one of the most well-deserved nicknames there is. Now, as a lifelong Lakers fan, I have to ask, how the hell did this man accomplish all of this put Los Angeles on his back to win the 1988 NBA championship, and yet does not have a statue in his honor outside of Staples Center. This legend isn't just criminally overlooked in the basketball community, but he's even overlooked in our own Laker nation. So just how good was James Worthy really? Well, he isn't incredibly high on many of the all-time statistical lists, but he was a key and vital star in the Lakers' Showtime Dynasty. He had a unique and efficient skill set, and he was one of the most clutch players to ever play the game of basketball. Let me know in the comments section how good James Worthy was in your own words.
First off, Michael Cooper of the Showtime Lakers. Cooper was a 6'7" shooting guard who was drafted by the Lakers in 1978 and was present for all 5 of their championship runs throughout the 80s. Los Angeles simply wouldn't have had the same level of success without this specialist, as he was one of the NBA's original 3-and-D type of players. Similar to a future Laker like Derek Fisher, Cooper hit numerous amounts of clutch three-pointers for Los Angeles just when his team needed them. In the 1987 NBA Finals, he even set the NBA record for the most three-pointers made in a finals game, with the total of 6. Obviously, that record has been broken plenty of times since then, but his snipe shooting ability was extremely rare in that era. What was arguably even more valuable than his three-point shooting, though, was his all-time great defense. Throughout the 80s, Cooper was almost always the Laker who had the assignment of guarding the all-time great wings, like Michael Jordan, Dominique Wilkins, and Larry Bird, and for good reason, as Cooper was possibly the best defending guard in the game. He was the NBA's Defensive Player of the Year in 1987, and he accomplished that despite being the 6th man that year. He made an incredible total of 8 all-defense teams throughout his career. To this day, only 12 players in NBA history have earned more selections than Cooper, and his 8 all-defense teams is the second most in Lakers franchise history, trailing only the great Kobe Bryant. The Showtime Lakers would have been a great contending team regardless, but make no mistake, they don't win 5 championships in the 80s without Michael Cooper. All the time, I see people engaging in the debate of who truly dominated Father Time, Michael Jordan or LeBron James. It's certainly not the worst argument to have, as both superstars were extremely impressive basketball players in their latter years. At 38 years old, LeBron took his Lakers all the way to the Western Conference Finals, while averaging these ridiculous numbers throughout the regular season. On the other hand, there's Michael Jordan, who joined one of the worst teams in the league at the age of 38, and up until he tore a ligament in his knee, he had them destined for the NBA playoffs. But what if I told you that neither of these legends were actually the GOAT candidate who had the most impressive accomplishment at that age? Today, our story takes us back to the mid-80s and the heat of the greatest rivalry in basketball history. At the end of the 1984 NBA season, the Lakers and Celtics had met up in the NBA Finals for the first time since the 1960s. It was an absolute classic, as the series was decided over 7 hard-fought games. At the end of the day, it was Larry Bird and the Boston Celtics who were taking home the Larry O'Brien Trophy. This started a new narrative amongst the media, that the Lakers were too old and the time of the Celtics had now arrived. In truth, the Lakers team as a whole wasn't tremendously old, but their captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, was now in his late 30s and in the twilight of his career. Regardless of whatever narratives the media could come up with, the fact remained, the Lakers and Celtics were easily the 2 best teams in the entire league. And after both teams won over 60 games throughout the regular season, they seemed on a collision course for a rematch in the 1985 NBA Finals. Magic Johnson was leading the Lakers, as he was now clearly coronated as the Lakers' best player within the franchise. On the other hand, Larry Bird had just won his 2nd straight league MVP, and was making a strong claim for the title of the best player in the NBA. At the time, the belief among general basketball audiences is that one of these 2 players would have been the deciding factor in the upcoming NBA Finals. The Celtics were the defending champions, and they had home court advantage for the rematch. The majority of the confidence seemed to be in their corner, and that would definitely be the case after Game 1. When the series began, the Lakers didn't even seem to be in the same league as Boston, as the Celtics were absolutely on fire from the field, while the Lakers looked slow, sluggish, and afraid of the moment. At the end of the night, the Celtics had completely destroyed the Lakers, with a final score of 148 to 114. To this day, this game is known as the Memorial Day Massacre. Despite the beatdown, Magic Johnson and James Worthy actually had decent outings for Los Angeles. But the player who didn't perform very well was their veteran center, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. On the night, Kareem only had 12 points and 3 rebounds, while he was simultaneously destroyed by the Celtics bigs, Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale. After the loss, the Lakers head coach Pat Riley was irate. Initially, he scolded the entire team, and then he pulled Kareem aside to scold him individually. The team proceeded to watch 4 hours of film, which was mostly centered around plays where Kareem had failed his assignments. Additionally, the media's response to this devastating loss was especially brutal on Kareem, as he was now 38 years old and in his 16th season in the NBA. Many were saying that Kareem was a liability for Los Angeles, and due to his tremendous mileage, critics were claiming that it was his time to retire in the off-season. Looking for comfort and inspiration, Kareem asked his father to accompany him on his way to attending Game 2. Kareem's dad actually rode the team bus to the stadium with the Lakers, which is usually something that was against the team's rules. But Pat Riley understood the uniqueness of the situation and sympathized with Kareem's need to be with his dad during that time. It served as an inspiration for both the players and Riley, who delivered an epic speech on the bus ride to the game. There was immense pressure on the entire team, but no player was facing more pressure than Kareem, whose entire position was under question from the media and from general basketball audiences. There are many examples of NBA legends facing intense criticism and needing to prove themselves to restore their reputation. This was one of the greatest examples of that in the history of the NBA. For Game 2 in Boston, Los Angeles was ready, but no player was more locked in than the heavily scrutinized Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. At the age of 38, with nearly 55,000 career minutes on his legs, Kareem mustered up one of the all-time great performances in finals history. Offensively, defensively, and on the boards, he excelled well beyond the efforts of the Celtics bigs, as Kareem poured in 30 points, 17 rebounds, 8 assists, and 3 blocks on 58% shooting. It was a game the Lakers needed, not just to tie the series, but also for their confidence. And thanks to Kareem, they got the victory in Game 2, 109 to 102. In Game 3, Kareem continued his redemptive dominance, as he dropped 26 points, 14 rebounds, and 7 assists on 77% shooting. And the Lakers won that game as well, 136 to 111. Heading into Game 5, the series was tied at 2 games apiece, and with Games 6 and 7 scheduled to take place in Boston, the Lakers recognized Game 5 as a must-win situation. Despite everything he had provided up to that moment, the Lakers had to lean on their aging captain yet again, and once again, he rose to the occasion, as Kareem put up 36 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 blocks, leading the Lakers to a 120 to 111 victory. If there was any doubt on who was going to win this series, Kareem authoritatively put that to rest. And after yet another strong performance in Game 6, the Lakers had won the championship in the Garden with a final score of 111 to 100. On the series as a whole, Kareem averaged 25.7 points, 9 rebounds, 5.2 assists, and 1.5 blocks on a lethal 60.4% shooting. At the age of 38 years and 54 days, he became the oldest Finals MVP in the history of the game. It's still the NBA record to this very day, and second place isn't remotely close, which was LeBron James in 2020, who won the award at 35 years and 284 days. In all 76 years of the NBA's existence, no other great has ever done anything like this. Players have played relatively well around the age of 40, but no one else at that age has appeared to be the best player on a court full of Hall of Famers on the game's biggest stage. It is worth mentioning that one of the reasons that people take this performance for granted is because Kareem played effective basketball for another 4 seasons after this, winning an additional 2 championships. He finally retired way after the critics initially told him to, at the age of 42. So listen in, Jordan stans and LeBron stans. Maybe it's best if you both just stop fighting, and instead recognize who's the real father of Father Time, the legendary Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So what do you guys think? Where do you rank Kareem among the greatest players in NBA history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Throughout the years, there have been many different rivalries within the NBA, some between teams and some between individuals. But none of them have ever been as unique and as special as Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird. There are so many aspects that make their competitive rivalry a completely unique tale. For one, their rivalry started before the pros. The 1979 NCAA championship between Michigan State and Indiana State brought in a record 35.1 million viewers, making it the most watched NCAA basketball game of all time. Another unique and incredible aspect to their rivalry is the fact that they were so good immediately upon entering the NBA. Both legends began playing in the NBA in the 1979 to 1980 season, and they didn't waste any time making an immediate impact on the league. Bird had a ridiculous rookie season, averaging 21 points, 10 rebounds, 4.5 assists, and 1.7 steals, while playing all 82 games. He improved his Celtics from a 29-win team to a 61-win team in his rookie season, which is one of the greatest season-to-season turnarounds in NBA history. He was rewarded with the NBA's Rookie of the Year trophy. On the other hand, you had Magic Johnson. In his rookie campaign, he averaged 18, 8, 7, and 2.4 steals, while improving his Lakers from a 47-win team to a 60-win team. Then he simply went on to win the NBA championship and the Finals MVP at just the age of 20. This was where he famously started Game 6 at center, in place of the injured Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and had what was likely the greatest Finals performance ever, as he dropped 42 points, 15 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 steals on 61% shooting. Imagine in the modern day, two rookies in the same season, fresh after a battle in the national championship game, and one goes on to lead his team to one of the greatest turnarounds in league history, while the other leads his team to the championship, winning the Finals MVP. Social media would absolutely explode, and we would be witnessing an ESPN hype train for these two players like we've never seen before. Both players were insanely competitive. One had a flashy and attention-grabbing personality, while the other was a more introverted and blue-collar type of person. Both had a beautiful understanding of the game, with a basketball IQ that was off the charts. Both guys made their chances better by making their teammates better. From their perspective, their rivalry was intense, fierce, and obsessive. But to the audience that witnessed them, they'll tell you that it was the most beautiful basketball that they've ever seen. For an entire decade straight, at least one of them was present in the NBA Finals. Now consider the fact that these guys were the greatest rivals in basketball history, regardless of the fact that they played in separate conferences. Usually, the greatest rivalries in sports are within the same conference, because they naturally face each other more times, and the odds are greater of them crossing paths in the playoffs. But Bird and Magic were so damn good that they were able to build their all-time great rivalry as out-of-conference competitors, thanks to the fact that they kept meeting up with each other in the championship games. To put it simply, there has never been another rivalry as strong, unique, and as special as Magic versus Bird, and I'm willing to bet that we'll never, ever see another one quite like it ever again. Let me first clarify, you saw what the video title is, but what may be an even more descriptive title would be NBA series that determine the pecking order. What I essentially mean is specific playoff series in NBA history that went a certain way, but if it had gone differently, then it would have completely switched the all-time rankings of the two superstars involved. To me, this video is a very simple concept, but it's also a fascinating topic because it really shows you the significance of each playoff series and of each individual game, and sometimes of even one shot. In one evening, a player's legacy can be completely altered for decades to come, simply based on how he performs against the other star on that specific night. Hopefully, this all makes sense, but if not, you'll get it by the end of the first segment. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson in the 1987 NBA Finals. This was the third time that these two rivals met up in the finals during the 1980s, and it was massive in terms of bragging rights, because the winner of that series was taking a 2-championships-to-1 lead in those 80s matchups. Well, as you all know, Magic Johnson and the Lakers went on to defeat the Celtics in 6 games. Magic put up monstrous averages, was the finals MVP, and even had the iconic game-winning hook shot in Game 4. But even more significant than that was the fact that Magic secured his 5th championship ring compared to Bird's 3. And one of the lasting images from that battle was when Larry was in a press conference after suffering defeat and admitted that he believed Magic Johnson was simply the better player.
Magic's just a great basketball player. He's the best I've ever seen, you know. Unbelievable. I don't know what to say.
Now, over 3 decades later, Magic Johnson is usually recognized as the player who's higher on the all-time list. But I honestly believe that all changes if the Celtics had won the series. Think about it. Larry Bird was leading Magic in MVP awards at that point 3-2, and Bird had just won 3 out of the last 4 MVP awards. Many people were already thinking that Larry was the better individual player. If the Celtics had won, Magic would have just 4 championships to Larry Bird's 4, and Bird would then also have the edge in Finals MVPs 3-2. Beyond that, Bird would have the last laugh, defeating Magic 2 out of the 3 times that they met on the game's biggest stage. Not only was this one series so massive, but you could even argue that the legacies were defined on the last shot of Game 4. If Bird buries that game winner, then the Celtics would have had a commanding 3-2 lead by the end of Game 5. But alas, he missed the shot, and the Lakers went on to close out the series soon afterwards. This whole thing really gives you some perspective on just how closely competitive their rivalry truly was. Last on the list is Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson in the 1991 NBA Finals. This was a highly anticipated and extremely hyped matchup between the guy seen as the face of the league and the guy seen as the future face of the league. When it comes down to it, Jordan and the Bulls simply had the better roster, as they closed out the series in just 5 games. Not only do I believe that this series would have shifted their rankings if it had gone differently, but I believe it would have them completely switch places as to who's widely recognized as the greatest player of all time. You need to understand, the Lakers didn't win this series and they should not have won this series. Magic no longer had the assistance of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had retired somewhat recently. On top of that, Magic's Lakers were short-handed, as his 2 best scoring weapons, James Worthy and Byron Scott, both missed significant time in the finals due to injuries. Even against all odds, if Magic somehow won the title instead of Jordan, it would give Magic 6 rings to Jordan's 5, and it would be the lasting image of Magic's career that he bested Jordan in his final season, in a series that he wasn't supposed to win. For MJ, it would have been a whole new damning narrative, that he was never able to win until Magic allowed him to by retiring. People would be saying that Magic was the face of the 80s, and he could have been the face of the 90s if he didn't get HIV. From that perspective, in that reality, I don't see how anyone could have comfortably referred to Michael Jordan as the greatest player of all time when Magic Johnson had that as his legacy. The 1986-87 Los Angeles Lakers, who many people consider as the strongest championship group of the Showtime Lakers era. The Lakers organization has an incredibly strong and rich history, with many greats represented by some of the greatest players of all time. Even with all those great teams considered, many people still recognize this '87 group as the greatest Laker team, or even the greatest basketball team of NBA history. No team greater represents the Lakers' brand, culture, and identity than the Showtime Lakers, whose fast-paced and exciting style of play helped define an entire era of NBA basketball. Leading this group at the point guard position was none other than the incredibly dynamic Earvin "Magic" Johnson. The 6'9" point guard had the first of his 3 MVP seasons, as he was the engine that drove the Lakers' high-octane offense. With his sudden and pinpoint decision-making, all of his teammates had to be ready at all times for the easier scoring opportunities that Magic would provide for them. It was another remarkably productive year from Magic, as he averaged about 24 points, a league-leading 12.2 assists, 6.3 rebounds, and over 1.5 steals on 52.2% shooting. Simply put, it was one of the greatest dual-threat seasons the league has ever seen, as Magic wasn't just the NBA's leader in assists per game, but he was also top 10 in points per game, which is easily the highest anyone has ever ranked in scoring, while averaging at least 12 assists per game. His support in the backcourt was the underrated 6'3" shooting guard Byron Scott. Scott loved to be on the finishing end of Magic's fast break, and had a solid mid-range pull-up jumper. He didn't shoot a tremendous amount of threes, but when he did, he was one of the most efficient shooters in the entire league, as he hit 43.6% from that distance, which was the 4th best percentage in the entire league. His offensive impact should get more credit for his team's success, as he put up 17 points per game during the 86-87 regular season. Starting at small forward was the 6'9" star, big game James Worthy. James is one of the most overlooked greats of basketball history and was the perfect running mate for Magic Johnson. James loved to run the floor and score in transition, and was the most frequent beneficiary of Magic's no-look passes. That wasn't the only way he scored his points though. James was great with his back to the basket and in face-up situations with the opponent, as he had one of the quickest first steps the game has ever seen. His unique ability to find his way to the paint led him to have an elite field goal efficiency, especially at his position, as he shot 53.9% on the season. He was selected to be an All-Star for the 2nd straight season, and on the year, he averaged nearly 20 points and 6 rebounds. Starting at power forward was the young AC Green, who always played with hustle and heart, and who was a couple rebounds short of a double-double average in only 28 minutes per game. AC certainly wasn't one of the major stars on the Lakers roster, but his contribution shouldn't be downplayed, as he was solid defensively in the interior, and he was very reliable at securing the boards. He's also the most dependable player of all time when it comes to availability, as AC is easily the all-time record holder for consecutive games played, and only missed 3 games throughout the entirety of his career. Then of course, starting at center was the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. At 39 years old, Kareem certainly wasn't anywhere near his prime anymore, but his age didn't stop him from being one of the better centers of the NBA, as he poured in his 17.5 points per game and 6.7 rebounds on his typical incredibly efficient field goal percentage. Despite his age, Kareem was still very capable of finishing in the fast break, but the majority of his production came in half-court sets with his iconic skyhook shot, which, coming from the 7'2" Kareem, is probably the most indefensible shot the game has ever seen. Accompanied with their all-time great starting 5 was a powerful bench, especially concerning the first 3 players of the second unit. First off is Michael Cooper. Cooper is probably the greatest perimeter defender that no one talks about. He was incredibly tenacious with his on-ball defense, and was usually the player who was assigned to contain the opponent's best perimeter score. For his career, Cooper made an astonishing 8 all-defense teams, and his 1987 campaign was even better, as he was that season's Defensive Player of the Year. He was one of the original 3-and-D type of players, as he shot 38.5% from three-point range on 2.8 three-point attempts per game, which, believe it or not, was actually a lot of attempts in the 80s, and he attempted the second most three-point shots that season among all NBA players. Midway through the season, the Lakers acquired Michael Thompson in a trade. He was a 6'10" center/power forward who was a finesse type of player. He was a solid scoring threat in his days before Los Angeles, averaging as many as 20 points per game. But with this all-time great Lakers squad, he would simply need to be a spark off the bench, and that's exactly what the 32-year-old did, as he chipped in with over 11 points and 5 rebounds on only 23 minutes per game. Also in the heart of the rotation was the 6'8" Kurt Rambis, who didn't have a pretty style of play, but he was another one of those players who did the little things well. he would fight for loose balls, help defend the Celtics bigs, and was always a sure thing to give 100% effort. This powerful roster of incredible individual players was a team that seemed tailor-made for Magic Johnson's skill set, as every member of the roster, including Kareem, was excellent at running the floor and pushing the tempo. I know I've alluded to this several times so far in this video, but I can't emphasize enough how uniquely fast this group was, as they treated every gained possession like it was the start of a track meet. Sometimes it almost seemed like they were completely forcing a fast break tempo, but even then, they still found ways to make it work. If they had to slow things down, they could, as Magic sometimes orchestrated the offense like a quarterback from the top of the key, and there's not many players who are better scoring options in the post than Kareem and James Worthy. Under Pat Riley's strong leadership and insatiable desire to win, this Lakers team had the league's best 65-17 record throughout the regular season. In the playoffs, no one was a challenge for them throughout the Western Conference, as they swept the Denver Nuggets in 3 games, defeated the Golden State Warriors in 5 games, and then swept the Seattle Supersonics out of the Western Conference Finals. Waiting for them in the NBA Finals was their rival and true challengers, the Boston Celtics. This was simply Los Angeles' time though, as they controlled the pace of the series and imposed their will upon Boston, defeating them in 6 games. To go along with Magic's iconic game-winning baby skyhook in Game 4, he also put up an incredibly monstrous stat line, nearly achieving the first triple-double average in NBA Finals history. It was a series performance that was so impressive that by the end of it, even Larry Bird was conceding that Magic Johnson had become the best player in the NBA. Looking at the results of this group over the 1987 season, we see that the Lakers finished with a league-best 65-17 record. They statistically had the league's best offense and the 7th best defense overall that season. They beat teams by a strong average of 9.3 points over the course of the season, and they coasted through the playoffs with a 15-3 record, represented by that season's MVP and Finals MVP, Magic Johnson. There's many GOAT-worthy teams of NBA history, but in a 7-game playoff series, this team may very well be the best of the best. As far as how they would match up against the other all-time great teams, well, I think the key would be for them to control the game's tempo, and if they were able to do that, then there's a decent chance that no one would beat them in a 7-game series, as a high-scoring and free-flowing style plays too much into the hands of this team. The key would be to get them to play in a physical half-court game, which is something the 96 Bulls or 89 Pistons may have been able to do successfully in a hypothetical matchup. So what do you think? Is the 87 Lakers the greatest team of all time? Are they even the greatest Laker team of all time? Let me know in the comment section below.
He's known as the captain, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. For many years, he was the NBA's all-time leading scorer, and before Michael Jordan won his 6 championships, most people considered Kareem as the greatest player in basketball history. To this day, some still do. Heading into the 1988-89 NBA season, Kareem was 41 years old. He was a 6-time league MVP, a 6-time NBA champion, and a 2-time Finals MVP. Alongside of Magic Johnson and James Worthy, Kareem and the Lakers were looking for their 3rd straight title. It was an extra emotional time in Los Angeles though, because Kareem had announced that this would be his last season in the NBA long before the regular season had concluded. With this in mind, the Lakers were motivated to win the championship yet again for their star center, sending him out on a high note and delivering a storybook ending. But now we fast forward in time. In June of 1989, the NBA Finals were about to take place between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Detroit Pistons. At first glance, it seemed like a colossal battle between 2 dynastic teams, but to understand the shocking results of this series, context is needed. The Detroit Pistons were a strong team who had finished the regular season with a 63-19 record. The team was rich in talent with veterans like Isaiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, Mark Aguirre, Dennis Rodman, and Vinnie Johnson. They had an all-time great defense and one of the deepest rosters the NBA had ever seen. All of this team was incredibly talented and appeared on paper as if they were championship ready, but the Pistons were yet to prove it in the postseason, and many were skeptical about their abilities to dethrone the defending champions. Just 1 year earlier, the same 2 teams met in the 1988 NBA Finals, and after a long, hard-fought 7-game series, the Lakers had come out on top, like they had many times throughout the 1980s.
The Los Angeles Lakers were heading into the '89 finals as the defending back-to-back NBA champions, who were seeking the NBA's first three-peat since the 1960s. All of the momentum was clearly on the Lakers' side. The 1987 and 1988 Los Angeles Lakers are still recognized even to this day among the greatest teams in NBA history. The Lakers had begun the decade with a championship and were looking to finish off the decade with their third straight championship and sixth championship in the 80s. They seemed poised to do it too. Magic Johnson was arguably the NBA's best player at the time and led the Lakers to have the best offense in the NBA that season, while securing the League MVP award. He was accompanied by his usual Hall of Fame supporting cast, like James Worthy, who was in the prime of his career and was coming off of last year's Finals MVP award. And of course, he also had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, that would be retiring at the end of the season. So the still productive captain of the Los Angeles Lakers was anticipating a fairy tale ending for his career, securing a legendary 7th NBA championship ring as he rode off into the sunset. The story of the season appeared to be indicating that destiny was in fact on the Lakers' side. Not only was the narrative supporting the Lakers, but so was the eye test. The Lakers were an absolute juggernaut throughout the 1989 Western Conference playoffs. The Lakers began the first round of the playoffs by sweeping the talented Portland Trail Blazers 3-0. The second round, they swept an even better Sonics team 4-0. And then they destroyed the powerful 55-win Phoenix Suns in the conference finals 4-0. The Lakers were undefeated throughout the Western Conference playoffs. They were heading into the NBA Finals against the Detroit Pistons, looking to make history and become the only team ever to go undefeated in the NBA playoffs. As a quick recap, the Lakers were going for their third straight title against the team they had just beat the previous year, looking for the exclamation point of a sixth championship in a decade that they had already claimed as their own, led by the league MVP on the final year of arguably the greatest player of all time, with a chance to declare themselves as the greatest team of all time by finishing out an undefeated postseason run, which had never been done before in the history of the NBA. Both of these finals teams were incredibly talented and championship worthy, so a sweep wasn't necessarily expected, but it was presumed that if a sweep was going to happen, it was going to be the Lakers who were doing the sweeping. But as we like to say in the sports world, that's why they play the game. As a footnote, the Los Angeles Lakers shooting guard Byron Scott would be missing the series for his team after popping his hamstring in practice the day before the finals began. With that being said, Michael Cooper was replacing him in the starting lineup. Cooper was a former Defensive Player of the Year and a quality three-point shooter in the NBA during his era, so the Lakers still appeared to be in great shape. When the games began, the Pistons got off to a hot start and never relinquished it. The absence of Byron Scott was beginning to be felt in this series. With Scott unavailable, the Lakers' rotation suffered and defending all of the Detroit Pistons' perimeter scoring guards became even more difficult. The Pistons took the first game 109-97, leaving the Lakers' hopes of an undefeated postseason run in shambles. The Lakers were poised to bounce back in Game 2. Despite Joe Dumars taking advantage of the Lakers being shorthanded on guards and dropping 24 points in the first half alone, the Lakers still managed to have a 62-56 lead at halftime. If the Lakers could hold on, they would be tying the series at a game apiece, while taking home court advantage with the series heading back to Los Angeles. But that's when disaster struck. With only several minutes left in the third quarter, the Lakers were up by a bucket, and Detroit was on a fast break when Magic Johnson started hobbling. He had pulled his hamstring, and the pain was clearly seen on his face. Magic wanted to push through it, but eventually he had no choice but to sit out the rest of the game. With their MVP gone, the Lakers fought valiantly, but ultimately came up short, falling to the Pistons 108-105. With Game 3 being played back in Los Angeles, the Lakers found themselves in a must-win situation. With the season on the line, Magic Johnson started Game 3, but he wouldn't last very long. After just 5 minutes of play, Magic left the game with severe pain in his hamstring. The still talented Lakers stepped up to the challenge and tried to win at home without their best player. But despite James Worthy's 26 points and Kareem's vintage effort of 24 points and 13 rebounds, the Pistons' healthy talent still prevailed in a close one, 114 to 110. At this point, the writing was on the wall for the Lakers. Magic Johnson didn't even try to play in the fourth game of the NBA Finals. James Worthy was one superstar who wasn't going out without a fight, and dropped an efficient 40 points in Game 4. Despite the Lakers' good start to the game, the Pistons' overall healthy talent eventually wore them down, winning the fourth and final game of the series, completing what is now known as one of the most stunning sweeps in NBA history. Kareem closed out his final game at the age of 42, while his iconic co-star was forced to watch from the sidelines. In that last performance, Kareem finished with just 7 points, 3 rebounds, and 3 assists on 2 of 8 shooting. Ultimately, it's not the worst way for a legend to end his career, but considering how things deteriorated in the NBA Finals and how the Lakers won the championship just a year prior, Kareem went down as another example of a player calling it quits just a little later than what would have been ideal. So what do you guys think? What is the most brutal ending to an NBA star's career? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comment section below.
So there's been many different eras in basketball history, and in specifically the 80s, that decade is known for a few major aspects. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird's rivalry, the beginning of Michael Jordan's career, and of course, the Bad Boy Pistons. But outside of that, there's still many talented teams and players who don't get the attention they deserve. Today, upon viewer request, I'm diving into the Western Conference in the 1980s as we evaluate how good and how deep that conference was at this period. We're starting off with the most obvious team, the Los Angeles Lakers. They were a legitimate super team led by their trio of Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and James Worthy. We already know a ton about the first two. Magic Johnson was the greatest point guard of basketball history, who led the Lakers' fast-paced and high-octane offense to earn the nickname Showtime. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, known as the captain, was still an elite center in the league, although he was past his prime days of the 1970s. Still, he fit in beautifully as a big man in Magic's fast break. And when the Lakers chose to slow it down, there was no better way to get a sure bucket than dropping it into the post where Kareem could use his indefensible skyhook shot. The guy who's the most underrated one in this mix is big game James Worthy, whose nickname was very fitting considering the fact that he was one of the most clutch performers the game has ever seen. He averaged around 20 points per game during his prime, and the 6'9" small forward had one of the quickest first steps the game has ever seen. I've said this before and I'll say it again. James Worthy deserves his own statue outside of Staples Center. Without him, the Lakers certainly don't win the 1998 NBA championship over the Pistons in 7 games. In that 7th and deciding game, James dropped 36, 16, and 10 on 68% shooting and was named the Finals MVP of that series. Along with that all-time great trio, they also had a significant amount of depth, including their 6'5" shooting guard, Michael Cooper, who was a part of all 5 of their championship runs that decade. Cooper was one of the original 3-and-D type of players, and he's one of the great defensive players that most young viewers have never heard of. He made 8 straight all-defense teams that decade and was the 1987 Defensive Player of the Year. They also had a quality transition scorer in Byron Scott, and they also had a 6th Man of the Year candidate, Michael Thompson, in the second half of the decade. Considering how overpowered this juggernaut was, it's no wonder they represented the West in the NBA Finals 8 out of 10 seasons. The second team we're looking at is the Houston Rockets. They were not great in the first half of the decade, but after acquiring Hakeem Olajuwon in the 1984 draft, that all would quickly change. The Twin Tower combination of Ralph Sampson and Hakeem Olajuwon quickly made them prominent contenders in the West. They also had key scoring sparks like Lewis Lloyd and Robert Reed. They made it as far as the NBA Finals in 1986, and after they had defeated the favored Lakers in the West Finals, the hype around this team was immense. With Hakeem at the age of 23 and Sampson at the age of 25, it seemed as if it was only a matter of time before the league was theirs. Unfortunately, their success was short-lived, and so was the career of Sampson, as he began dealing with significant back and knee problems that had him out of the league by the time he was barely into his 30s. The next team is one of the less talked about and fascinating gems of the 1980s, and that's the Denver Nuggets. They were led by 2 solid and relatively unknown stars, Alex English and Fat Lever. Of all the players in the entirety of the 1980s, no one scored more total points than Alex English, who averaged as high as 29.8 points per game in 1986. He was an incredibly efficient 6'7" small forward who had a lethal mid-range jump shot with an extremely high release point that was rarely blocked, which led him to make 8 straight All-Star teams in that era. His co-star was the 6'3" point guard/shooting guard Lafayette Lever, known as Fat Lever for short. Lever was a pretty good distributor and a reliable scorer who was very close to 20 points per game during his prime. With this duo leading the way, Denver had an extremely fast and potent offense. In 6 out of the 10 seasons that decade, Denver led all teams in points scored. They were a contender, and they had a potential championship team if it wasn't for one major problem. They were terrible defensively, and when I say terrible, I mean excruciatingly awful. The concept was basically that the best defense was more offense. Every season that decade, they finished as a bottom 5 team in points allowed, including 4 straight seasons where they were the worst in the entire league. Despite all of their defensive woes, this team still made it to the conference semifinals 4 times, and they made it to the Western Conference Finals in 1985, where they lost in 5 games to the eventual champion Los Angeles Lakers. Then there was the Utah Jazz, who were among the worst teams in the league for the first half of the decade. But around the mid-80s is when they added Karl Malone and John Stockton, and their fortunes began to shift. Malone and Stockton are most famously known for their 2 trips to the NBA Finals in 1997 and 1998, but their best seasons statistically actually came in the late 80s. Nobody really reflects on the 80s Jazz as a Big 3 team, but you could, considering the underrated big man they had down low, the 7'4" monster Mark Eaton. Despite not being very well known, Mark was one of the greatest defensive players to ever live. To say that it was difficult to score over Mark in the paint would be a massive understatement, as he made 5 all-defense teams, was the Defensive Player of the Year twice, and he led the league in blocks 4 times, including the 1985 season where he averaged 5.6 blocks per game. Officially, that's the highest blocks per game average for a season in NBA history. They also had one of the forgotten great leapers of years past, the 6'4" shooting guard Daryl Griffith. Daryl could score and he had a reliable jump shot, but what he was known for more than anything was his incredible dunks, which earned him the nickname Dr. Dunkenstein. He wasn't a great defensive player, but he scored over 20 points a game for his first 5 seasons. Unfortunately, injuries shortened his career, and he began having those injuries right around the time that Malone and Stockton joined the team, so their prime didn't quite overlap, as he was only a 10 to 15 points per game scorer by the time that Malone and Stockton broke out as superstars. Despite being rich in talent, they still were not able to get past Magic Johnson's super team, getting as far as Game 7 of the 1988 West Semifinals, where the eventual champion Lakers closed it out. Another team who was making deep runs in the West playoffs was the well-balanced Dallas Mavericks. Their leading star was the elite scorer, Mark Aguirre, who spent his prime 8 seasons with the Dallas Mavericks before he eventually won 2 championships with the bad boy Pistons. He put up strong numbers in his years as a Maverick, averaging as high as 29.5 points per game in 1984. His co-star was the reliable and consistently good scorer, Rolando Blackman. The 6'6" guard was another one of those great mid-range shooters of the 80s, and his prime years saw about 20 points per game on over 50% shooting. Some great role players got their start there as well, like one of the original stretch 4 shooters, the 6'9" Sam Perkins, and a future 6th Man of the Year, the 6'10" Detlef Schrempf. At their best 3-year stretch with their many weapons, this unit was seen as a legitimate threat to the Lakers. And in 1988, they made it to the Western Conference Finals, where they pushed Magic, Kareem, and Worthy's Lakers to 7 games before Los Angeles closed it out. The last one to highlight is more so a player than an entire team, and that's the 6'10" power forward Tom Chambers. He was a 4-time All-Star and one of the premier scorers of that decade. His greatest performance was a 60-point explosion in a revenge game against his former team. He was an incredible athlete who could play above the rim and has one of the most ridiculous-looking dunks of all time. He spent most of his years in the 80s with the Seattle Supersonics, but it wasn't until he joined the Phoenix Suns that he got his first taste of competing. In 1989, Chambers and Kevin Johnson led the Suns to a 55-27 record, while Chambers was averaging over 25 points per game. They then cruised to the Western Conference Finals before they were swept by the defending champion Lakers. These were pretty much all of the competing teams in the Western Conference during the 80s. Although I do think there was some pretty solid teams, and you could certainly argue that the West 80s was underrated, they certainly weren't as strong as the fiercely competitive Eastern Conference. In the 1980s, there were 25 50-win teams in the Western Conference. In the 80s for the Eastern Conference, there was 35 50-win teams, which pretty much sums up the balance of power during that decade. And that's certainly interesting because it's arguably the last decade we've seen where the East was stronger than the West. The West in the 80s certainly wasn't one of the greatest conferences we've ever seen, but due to the rich Eastern Conference in that decade, and due to the overpowered Lakers representing the West in the NBA Finals 8 out of 10 years, there have unfortunately been some nice teams and quality players who become lost and overlooked in the game's history. Hopefully this video helped shine a spotlight on some of them. If you've ever been a part of NBA debates that involve discussions about the 1980s, then you know that people can be pretty divided on their opinions on the style and quality of basketball that came from that era, and even about what that era represented. As someone who loves that era of NBA basketball and who has personally watched hundreds of hours throughout my life of it, I feel like I can offer a bit of clarification on how people can accurately view this decade. I want to start by tackling several aspects about the decade and talk about what's true, what isn't true, and what you might have not known. First, we'll start with one of the most argued over topics, defense. The current perception of 80s defense depends on who you ask. If you ask a fan from an older generation, more often than not, they're going to tell you that defense was greater at that time, that back then, they played grown man defense. They would always punish each other physically back then, and nowadays, they can barely even touch each other. This is their narrative. But if you ask a lot of younger fans, they don't have to deal with the nostalgia bias, but they also have the disadvantage of not actually watching those games. Those younger fans will say things like defense was less advanced back then, and that it was easier to score and not as physical as advertised. There's even compilation videos on YouTube of bad defense from the 80s, where guys are given little resistance and minimal hustle and effort is on display. So what gives? You've got two different groups saying totally opposite things about a specific decade. Well, as usual, the truth lies somewhere in the middle and a little off to the side. Let's start with the facts and details we know about 80s basketball. Now, the 1980s was actually very close in total offense. Throughout that decade, teams usually averaged around 109 points per game, which is also a lot of offense. Not only that, but throughout the 80s, teams shot 48% from the field compared to today's 46%. In fact, in terms of field goal percentage, the 1980s were the most efficient decade in all of NBA history. I could break down all the statistical league averages in detail, but here's what you need to know. Today, the league is very high scoring. The 2000s were very low, the late 90s were very low, the early 90s were high, and the 1980s were very high. So immediately, at face value, it appears the 80s defensive era narrative has been pretty overblown, based on how many points they were scoring and how efficiently they were scoring. But what we need to understand was that the biggest contributing factor to this was the pace of play. The 1980s was some of the most fast-break, transition-heavy basketball the league has ever seen. In today's game, most of the very high scoring comes from the inflation of three-point attempts. But in the 80s, it was more due to the fact that most games looked like a track meet. The Showtime Lakers of the 80s were famous for this, since Magic Johnson was always pushing the tempo. But it wasn't just them. Many teams played a fast break style, like the Denver Nuggets, who were notorious for their incredibly fast and potent offense, but also a terrible defense. The Pistons, despite their defensive perception, also ran the fast break a lot and could score a ton of points. And there were also teams like Phoenix, Dallas, Portland, and Philadelphia. So transition basketball was pretty much the norm in those days. And what do you get with a lot of fast breaks? Plenty of layups and dunks, which are easier opportunities. Easier opportunities equals a higher field goal percentage. The highest scoring game in NBA history actually came from this era, which was on December 13, 1983, when the Detroit Pistons defeated the Denver Nuggets in triple overtime, 186 to 184. These were the Pistons, who were known for their physicality, their Jordan rules, and their overall punishing defense. So how in the world could this defensively revered squad be involved in a game where the final score was in the 180s? It's starting to sound like this whole defensive era thing is just a huge myth. Well, we're not done yet. And that brings us to the next aspect that goes somewhat hand in hand with this one, physicality. One of the biggest influences in the different eras that people don't usually think of is the flagrant foul rule. Most of you know the details of the flagrant foul, but for those who don't, it's a foul where unnecessary roughness is used on another player. Many times it's called when there is a blow to the head or strong physical contact that was in no way a play on the basketball.
Committing this flagrant foul can be devastating to the team that does it, because it results in either 1 or 2 free throws and maintained possession of the ball, and often an ejection of the player who committed the foul. This is a pretty good rule. It keeps players protected, it keeps players from unnecessary serious injuries, and it often keeps tense moments from escalating into really ugly situations. And this rule did not exist until 1990. That means that in the fullness of the 1980s, almost every hard foul was just considered a common foul. If this is the case, doesn't it make sense to hit the offensive player a little harder to make sure he doesn't get an and one? Doesn't it make sense to put a little extra on it if it means they think twice before attacking the basket next time? The games in the 80s weren't always played with this physically punishing nature, only when they needed to be, like for the Jordan rules or in the NBA playoffs. In the postseason, where every possession and every point counts, players would often exercise this freedom for the sake of trying to win the ball game. It wasn't that this generation of players was naturally more violent, it's that they were allowed to be. The truth is, just like modern basketball, there were players who played great defense, and there were players who played terrible defense. The key differences were the high-octane pace of play and the permissible hard fouls. In the 1980s, it was possible to have both a league where teams could score into the 120s and a league where games would become very physical and the style would change significantly. There was a term back in the day that was common among players, coaches, referees, and commentators: setting the tone. You don't hear it much anymore in today's game, but back then it was very important, and it essentially meant that they were coming out of the gates to start the game, setting the tone for the game's pace, style, and physicality. Nowadays, the game is much more consistent in terms of its style and physicality, because the rules have become much more clear on what is acceptable and what's not, what is permissible contact and what isn't. In the 80s, it was easier for players to control the game and more difficult for the referees to control the game, because pretty much anything goes. For example, it was common for teams like the Celtics and Pistons to be even more physical in matchups with the Lakers, trying to take them out of their finesse style of basketball. They came out of the gates setting the tone, and oftentimes, it worked. The next aspect is athleticism. You've heard it, and I've heard it. The idea that players back then were slower, weaker, and smaller than modern-day athletes. Is it somewhat accurate? Probably. Is it also grossly exaggerated? Probably that too. In the past 10 years of modern NBA basketball, the average height of the NBA player is 6 foot 7 inches tall and weighs 220.7 pounds. In the 10 years of the 1980s, the average height was also 6 foot 7 inches tall and the average weight was 207 pounds. So although they stood just as tall side to side to one another, the major difference was the weight of the players at nearly 14 pounds less. Simply put, this difference was usually made up of muscle mass. Modern players have an advantage with modern training methods, eating habits, and fitness routines. Guys in the 80s were simply skinnier, but many of them were still very athletic and had lean muscle. They just overall looked a little less physically imposing than today's players. This has partially led some newer fans to criticize this era when they're looking at some of the most non-threatening and least athletic players of the 80s. They'll say things like the league was packed with part-time plumbers and accountants. I hate it when people say this though, because it's easy to take small samples and condemn an entire era for it. It's almost like when people think of the state of athleticism in 2020, they automatically think of Giannis. And when they think of the state of athleticism in the 90s, they think of Jeff Hornacek. The problem with that is that it's erring on an extreme example, and isn't a proper survey of the athleticism of the league as a whole at that time. Want another example? Picture 20 years from now. People are hating on LeBron James, saying he didn't play in a strong era of real athleticism, and here's their future arguments. How strong is LeBron's era in 2016 when he lost the MVP race to a guy who struggles to dunk a basketball? How strong could that era have been when one of the best players in the league was someone who was consistently overweight? In LeBron's era, he played against plumbers like JJ Redick and Kelly Olynyk. How weak were the athletes in LeBron's era if a guy who was only 5 foot 9 inches tall could average nearly 30 points per game? Don't you guys see how ridiculous and biased these statements are?
Although many of the statements are true to an extent, they're cherry-picking details and acting as if it's the complete picture. They're completely lacking context, but statements like these are usually just emotionally motivated agendas in order to build a negative narrative about a player that they don't like as much as their favorite player. People do this all the time with the 1980s. But when you look around the league in that era as a whole, you see guys who were incredible athletes like Dominique Wilkins, Kenny Skywalker, Michael Jordan, Darryl Dawkins, Charles Barkley, Gerald Wilkins, Julius Erving, Shawn Kemp, Xavier McDaniel, Hakeem Olajuwon, Karl Malone, James Worthy, Tom Chambers, Darrell Griffith, David Thompson, Terrence Stansbury, Clyde Drexler, Larry Nance, Dennis Rodman, Orlando Woolridge, David Robinson, Roy Hinson. Seriously, do I need to keep going? Many people are just too young or weren't watching at that time to know about a lot of the freakishly gifted athletes of the 1980s, just like how 20 to 30 years from now, many people won't know about many of the great athletes we watch in today's game. The final aspect is competition. I'll make this one quick, but since the 1960s when the Boston Celtics ruled the basketball world, the 1980s were the toughest era of competition in terms of how hard it was to break through and win a championship. That was because the 80s were, as I call it, the era of super teams. There was so much talent at the top of the league, and you had several dynasty-worthy rosters consistently duking it out. Part of that was how the league was rich with stars, but the other part was how there were only 23 teams in the league. Imagine today's NBA, and then we eliminate 7 of the teams, and then distribute the talent from those teams to the remaining 23 teams. Naturally, what would you get? A handful of super teams. This was essentially the NBA in the 1980s. Look around the teams of the league and who won championships in that decade. If you had just 1 or 2 stars on your team in that era, you're not winning a championship. You needed 3 or 4 and a deep bench just to even win 1 ring. With all this being said, am I saying that the 80s was the greatest era of basketball? Not necessarily, but it was a great era, with a crazy history, and with a fantastic collection of talent and athletes, and it certainly deserves your respect. Let me know in the comments section which decade you think had the greatest collection of talent. Thanks.
Earvin Magic Johnson, one of the greatest players in NBA history, and many people still believe he's the greatest point guard of all time. Magic obviously had a historic beginning to his career, but what I believe isn't talked about enough is the iconic farewell to his NBA career, which was a roller coaster of emotions for the basketball community, finishing off with a satisfying ending that I personally will never forget. In order to understand the impact of Magic's beautiful moment, we first have to understand his journey to get there. Let's go all the way back to early June of 1991. At this time, Magic Johnson is just 31 years old. He's the runner-up for the league MVP, and he was the MVP in the previous season. He's coming off of a regular season where he averaged nearly 20 points and 12.5 assists, and he's about to make his 9th NBA Finals appearance as a 5-time NBA champion. To summarize it all, Johnson had just entered his early 30s and appeared to be every bit as good as he ever was before. Even without the recently retired Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as a teammate, Johnson was still able to lead his Lakers to the NBA Finals yet again. He had already built a resume worthy of being called the greatest point guard ever, and he seemingly still had a second half of his career ahead of him. When the 1991 Finals began, Magic was going toe-to-toe with the prime Michael Jordan. And although Michael ended up being the Finals MVP, Magic displayed a remarkable effort of his own. Many people believe that the Lakers never really had a true opportunity in this series, since Magic's 2 best scoring options, James Worthy and Byron Scott, both dealt with injuries throughout and missed a significant amount of time. Even without his 2 best weapons in the elimination game, Magic still put up 16 points, 20 assists, and 11 rebounds. What he didn't realize, and what none of the audience had realized either, is that this would be his last NBA Finals game of his entire career. Because a few months later, on November 7th, 1991, Magic held one of the most shocking press conferences in the history of sports. It was at this moment that the world became aware that the face of the Showtime Lakers was now HIV positive. At the time, little was known about the disease, so the assumption from almost everyone was that in a matter of months, he would lose a tremendous amount of weight and then pass away. Along with the horrific news of Magic's health, he also made it aware to the world that he was retiring from the Lakers, effective immediately. Imagine your favorite basketball player being at the peak of his abilities, and in a matter of seconds, he goes from one of the best players in the game to a retired player who could pass at any moment. Needless to say, this was a jarring pill to swallow for basketball fans, as seemingly everyone had their hearts broken for Magic on that day. Over the next several months and years, people would begin to learn a lot about living with HIV and the various details, like how it's transmitted and who's at risk. But many were still scared about the idea of being in contact with someone who had it. Then, in February of 1992, things got really interesting for Johnson and the basketball world. The NBA All-Star Game is an exhibition event where the fans vote and determine who will play for each conference. Despite the fact that Magic had retired from basketball, the fans still voted him in to be the starting point guard of the Western All-Stars. After receiving approval from doctors and from the league for Magic to play, the hype train was officially underway. The thing is, not everyone was so enthusiastic. Many players were concerned about their own well-being. Even Magic's former teammates like Byron Scott and AC Green said that he shouldn't participate. The player who was the most vocal about his displeasure with Magic competing was the Western Conference All-Star Karl Malone, who had this to say before the game was played.
If I get in a collision with a guy, it don't have to be Magic. It can be Joe Smoke. But the fact of the matter is, if you got the AIDS virus, it'll be hard for me to play as hard as I'm capable of playing.
Although there was plenty of drama heading into that night, there was also plenty of teammates and competitors who encouraged Magic to participate. Just as a spectator, you could tell that there was this awkward, unspoken tension in the air. But you could also sense the excitement and the magnitude of the moment, as the Orlando crowd gave Johnson a standing ovation during player introductions. Everyone understood that the ideal outcome was the West winning and Magic securing the All-Star Game MVP. But regardless of how badly the crowd wanted that, he still had to go out there and perform well. Seeing that Magic hadn't played a game in nearly a year, and seeing how he was now dealing with a life-altering disease, many people were concerned that he wouldn't have the conditioning or stamina to hang with the best players in the world. But all of those concerns were quickly put to rest soon after tip-off commenced. Although he built a legacy for himself as mainly a distributor, Magic was looking to score early on, and he did so with tremendous efficiency. Throughout the night, the West played with more energy and effort, and a 10-point lead quickly became a 20-point lead, and then a 20-point lead suddenly became a 30-point lead. The outcome was never really in question, but the MVP of the game appeared to be up for grabs, and the Western Conference's Clyde Drexler appeared to be the favorite heading into the second half with a monstrous stat line. After looking to score for a while, Magic finally got his first assists of the game with just under 9 minutes left in the third quarter. And then he got on a roll with his flashy Showtime passes that we were accustomed to. With less than 3 minutes left in the game, Magic suddenly hit the switch and displayed one of the most beautiful finishes in All-Star Game history. Just so you can sense the gravity and energy of this inspiring moment, I'll let you guys watch the final sequences of this game with no voiceover. And please, pay attention to how Magic was at the center of it all.
135-106. With 2:46 to go, no doubt about this one.
There it is. There's the three.
Magic got his three.
Waiting for that moment to shoot the three.
Who has all the NBA three-point marks, most attempts, most made. Johnson, 2 in a row for Magic. He's going for the MVP. The Atlanta Hawk has 8. Chris Mullin for 3. It's out shooting the East in every quarter. And will be around the 60% mark, and another great pass. And Marley has his first points. Magic raises it. Well, this is a mismatch, and Magic would be the first to admit it. Michael Kind.
And that's two Magic said. Bring the next one on.
6-5. Three-pointer. Yes! Oh, my! Ladies and gentlemen, you just can't orchestrate it better than that.
When Magic hit that final falling away three-pointer, there was still 15 seconds left on the clock. Yet no one on the court seemed to even care, as they all surrounded and congratulated the Lakers legend. The game ended on the spot. It was a perfectly fitting and poetic way for the game to end, with a Magic Johnson jumper. Any question of who was the game's MVP now had an obvious answer, as Magic finished the game with 25 points, 9 assists, 5 rebounds, and 2 steals on 75% shooting. What started as a somewhat dramatic and awkward event ended up as one of the most uniting and inspiring conclusions in the history of sports. At the time, everyone believed that this was the last NBA game that he would ever participate in, and up until Kobe's farewell game in 2016, this exhibition contest stood alone as the most incredible farewell game by a Los Angeles Laker. Amazingly, over 3 decades later, Magic is still going, with the same smile and with the same enthusiasm that he was famous for. Today's list is a rather interesting one. I believe that I am objectively correct about this list, and there is no way I could possibly be wrong, simply because it's all based on personal preference. These were the top 6 most entertaining teams to me, based on a variety of aspects, like how exciting the highlights were, how intriguing the star power was, and how unique and fascinating their style of play was compared to the rest of NBA history. With that being said, these are just the teams that entertain me, so let me know what are your most entertaining teams in the comment section below. Number 6, the 2016 Golden State Warriors. To many people, the entertainment value of this squad hasn't aged as gracefully, because nowadays many people are exhausted by the rapid inflation of three-point shooting. I will say this though, I personally will never forget how mesmerizing the Warriors style and execution was back when I was seeing it in the 15-16 season. Steph was making over 400 three-pointers in a single season, at a time when no one else had even made 300. He was hitting shots from 30 feet and beyond with regularity and with a level of efficiency that we had never seen before in the history of the game. On top of that, the second best shooter in the entire league was his teammate. Seeing their ball movement, the way they spread the floor, and the way they dominated the game with their perimeter shooting is something that the fans and analysts never thought was possible before they came along. Add on the fact that Draymond Green was a wild card of drama, and add on the fact that Steve Kerr was their head coach, which meant that he had a unique perspective in the comparisons between the 96 Bulls and the 16 Warriors, and what you had was a recipe for some must-see basketball. Number 5, the Lob City Supersonics. If the Chicago Bulls dynasty was the hottest ticket in the 1990s, then the Payton and Kemp Sonics were not far behind. Back then, the Seattle crowd always had an electric and energetic atmosphere, and much of that was influenced by the product on the court. That Seattle team loved to run the fast break, and with Gary Payton at the helm, you had one of the best facilitators and, more importantly, one of the best lob passers that the game of basketball had ever seen. On the receiving end was none other than Shawn Kemp, one of the most athletic and thunderous finishers that I've ever seen. It wasn't just their highlights though, but it was also their personalities. Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp were competitive showmen that had an energy level that matched their exuberant home crowd. What made the whole experience even better was the fact that Kevin Calabro was their play-by-play commentator throughout the 1990s. Nowadays, he does an excellent job for the Portland Trail Blazers local broadcasts, but I personally always preferred him with the Sonics, as he had the perfect voice and energy for the product that was on the court. Number 4, the 99-2000 Shaq and Kobe Lakers. Now, this personal choice has a lot to do with the uniqueness of this team. Phil Jackson was running the triangle offense, and in this system, Shaquille O'Neal was operating as its centerpiece. During the Diesel's prime MVP season, everybody in Los Angeles and on the opposing end of the court knew what the game plan was. The Lakers were going to feed O'Neal, and a collaboration of big men would try their best to stop him, and usually they failed miserably. In the history of me watching basketball, I've never seen a player demand as much defensive attention as Shaq did at that time. He was a freakish anomaly that you only get to experience once in a lifetime. And if that wasn't your cup of tea, they had this young and upcoming player named Kobe Bryant, who was the closest thing we had ever seen to Michael Jordan in terms of his style, his skill, his mentality, and even his body language. He was the lightning to Shaq's thunder, and whether you were rooting for them or against them, you had to appreciate the amazing dynamic of their all-time great tandem. Number 3. The 7-second Phoenix Suns. It's hard to communicate to a younger basketball fan just how unique the Mike D'Antoni and Steve Nash-led Suns were in the mid-2000s. You never hear them say it, but it appeared as if their mindset was that the best defense was double the offense. The tempo was always at a blistering speed, as they believed that the highest quality shot was the one that was taken within the first 7 seconds of the possession. The concept was way ahead of its time, but today it's completely normal in the modern NBA. In that era, they were basically the only team that was pulling up for transition threes basically every other play. It was a foreign concept, and many close-minded analysts claimed that an NBA team could never win a championship with that approach. Although that was true specifically in the case of this Suns team, that playstyle and approach would go on to win championships in the future. You had Steve Nash delivering mesmerizing passes like a basketball magician. You had the Matrix finishing in transition. You had Amari Stoudemire absolutely posterizing defenders out of the pick and roll. And you had an array of three-point snipers from one of the most offensively talented teams of that era. It was a joy to watch. Number 2. The 2014 San Antonio Spurs. This one probably isn't the most surprising pick, as the 13-14 Spurs are frequently documented as one of the most beautiful and intelligent brands of basketball of all time. The team's IQ was off the charts, as Greg Popovich was at the height of his coaching abilities, and basketball veterans like Tony Parker, Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Boris Diaw, the execution was nearly flawless. Basically, every single player on that team was always looking to make the extra pass, as defenses were often struggling to keep up. It was the perfect blend of fundamentals, discipline, and analytics. Although most hardcore basketball fans appreciate this team today, it's a bit unfortunate that they weren't a bit more appreciated back then, as the quote, boring Spurs narrative was something that was still lingering amongst the casual fans. But for hardcore basketball fans like myself that absolutely love seeing the game played the right way, with a fluent and selfless style, this Spurs team was the standard of excellence. Number 1. The Showtime Lakers. Now before you jump into the comments, foaming at the mouth, calling me biased, let me confirm for you, I am totally biased. I grew up watching this Lakers team over and over again on my dad's VHS tapes, and they were one of the major catalysts that led me to fall in love with the game of basketball. Sure, I look at these Showtime Lakers with rose-tinted glasses, but I think I'm still correct when I say that I haven't seen another team like them in the years since. Thanks to the brilliant split decision making of Magic Johnson, this Lakers team used to treat basketball games like a track meet. Typically, teams will run a fast break when they have the numbers advantage, but Los Angeles didn't even need that. They would simply grab the rebound and immediately push the tempo without a second thought, because they believed they could execute better when the pace was high, and better than the defense could defend it. With guys like James Worthy and Byron Scott as running mates, Magic was constantly delivering no-look passes for crowd-igniting slams. The stars were on the court, the stars were in the crowd, and the game's greatest showman, with his exuberant character, put on the greatest show in basketball. And if, for some reason, that exhilarating pace of play wasn't working, they would simply dump the ball down in the post to the captain, and let him go to work with the most indefensible shot in basketball history, the skyhook. Their impact on the league is still felt to this day, as people continuously refer to transition highlights as Showtime. So what do you guys think? These are the teams that I enjoyed watching the most throughout the years. What are yours? I look forward to hearing your suggestions in the comment section below. Today's topic is one that I'm sure is going to have many people in their feelings. Just who are the top 10 greatest passers in NBA history? Well, I can't provide you with an objectively correct list, but I can give you my list based on my knowledge of NBA history and based on the criterias on which I'm ranking the list. So let's get into them. The first category is facilitating that leads to winning, because if it's not helping you be successful, then literally, what's the point? Second is the player's assist per game average, both in terms of their peaks and over the course of their careers. Third is their assist to turnover ratio, because getting a lot of assists isn't simply the best outcome if the player was incredibly sloppy with the basketball while doing it. Fourth is court vision and execution. How good was the player's ability to find the open man on the court and deliver him the ball with accuracy in a timely fashion? And the fifth and final category is longevity. It's one thing to be one of the best facilitators in the game for some time, but it's another level entirely to be able to do it for an entire era or two. So now that you guys see the logic, let's get into it. Number 10, Oscar Robertson. He wasn't necessarily the most flashy or highlight-worthy distributor, as Oscar leaned more on his fundamental disciplines while being one of the most effective floor generals in the game. Obviously, the fact that he played in the 1960s probably doesn't help his case much either, seeing how most of his dimes weren't even caught on film. With that being said, there's no question that the Big O was the most dominant giver of his era, as he led the NBA in assists per game a whopping 7 times in his career, and had an amazing career average of 9.5 per game. Unfortunately, the NBA did not track turnovers for individual players until the start of the 77-78 season, which naturally means that we can't gauge how clean his assist-to-turnover ratio was. But based on his reputation from his peers in that era, we can at least make the assumption that it's pretty solid. As impressive as he was, he had some natural limitations of his era working against him, so he'll have to settle for the 10th spot on this list. Number 9, Bob Cousy. Back when this man played, and back when his Celtics dominated the league, he was seen as an absolute savant with the basketball, which was why he was properly given the nickname the Houdini of the hardwood. Although he never once averaged at least 10 assists per game in a season, that was more of a product of his era, as what constituted an assist was a bit more specific at that time. Regardless, he led the NBA in assists per game a whopping 8 seasons straight, getting as high as 9.5 per game in 1960. He was certainly a much flashier passer than Oscar Robertson, but in a way that's similar to the Big O, he has the limitations of his era working against him, like the lack of certain statistics and the lack of available footage. And because of this, I have a difficult time ranking him any higher than this spot on my list. Number 8, Nikola Jokic. What's amazing is that this guy is still in his 20s, yet he's already this high on my list. The Joker's ability to find his open teammates and deliver them the rock with extreme precision is rivaled by very few. At this point, he's easily the greatest passing center that I've ever seen. And the fact that he's nearly been able to average as high as 10 assists per game in a season while not being the player consistently bringing the ball up the court is truly remarkable to say the least. In my opinion, that aspect elevates him quite a few spots when determining the rankings. There's almost no type of pass that the Joker can't make, as he has the strength and precision to be an all-time great outlet passer. He's an amazing lob passer, and he is absolutely remarkable at facilitating from the post, as his court awareness and his high offensive IQ makes it often appear as if he's got eyes in the back of his head. Number 7. Isaiah Thomas. He was the leader of the bad boy Detroit Pistons, who won back-to-back championships in 1989 and 1990, and he did it as an intimidating dual threat, who could score and distribute at will. The passing aspect is usually one of the more underappreciated aspects of his game, and if it wasn't for John Stockton, he would have the highest single-season assists per game average in NBA history when he had 13.9 in the 84-85 season. Without his incredible playmaking ability, the Pistons wouldn't have been perennial contenders in the Eastern Conference. Some of his incredible passing was overshadowed by the fact that he played in the same era as Magic Johnson. But make no mistake, Isaiah was elite at making quick, split-second decisions with his facilitating. Number 6. LeBron James. What players like the Joker lack in longevity, LeBron has several times over. He's only led the NBA in assists per game once in his 21-year career, but by the time his career is done, he may be as high as second all-time on the NBA's total assists list. LeBron has the offensive IQ and the court awareness to find the open shooter as soon as they have a second of daylight. The vast majority of his career has been as a forward, but that hasn't stopped James from usually operating as the team's floor general. Personally, I don't see LeBron as a pass-first player, like many of his fans like to claim, because although he gets plenty of assists, he's still usually among the league leaders in shots attempted per game. But you could argue that that makes his assist numbers even more impressive, considering how he could be routinely competing for the assist title if he was just a little less aggressive when it comes to his own scoring. It's a unique case, but without a doubt, it's worthy of a spot. Number 5. Chris Paul. Simply put, CP3 has one of the highest offensive IQs in the history of the NBA, as his elite playmaking have contributed to his teams being frequent playoff competitors. He's led the NBA in assists per game 5 separate times in his career, getting as high as 11.6 in 2008. On top of that, he's extremely careful with the basketball, as he's only had one season in his entire career where he's averaged at least 3 turnovers per game. In all of the other 18 seasons of his career, he's never once averaged more than 2.6 turnovers per game. This astounding longevity and consistency has given him a top 3 spot on the NBA's all-time assists list. One thing that's rarely mentioned is how this point guard has elevated other players to their peak while they were his teammate. Players like David West, Tyson Chandler, and DeAndre Jordan all experienced their best seasons while Chris Paul was feeding them. Number 4. Steve Nash. He's a 2-time MVP winner, and he was the leader of the famous 7-second offense that focused heavily on transition basketball, split decision making, and perimeter shooting. During his prime, he was the standard of a floor raiser, and the ultimate example of a guy who makes his teammates better. With the Phoenix Suns, Nash led the NBA in assists per game on 5 separate occasions, getting as high as 11.6 in 2007. This was also a time when the NBA was averaging less points league-wide. One can only imagine the kind of facilitating numbers he would average today if he played in this modern era. Even during times of chronic back pain, Nash remained among the league leaders in assists per game, and his impact on the game is still felt to this very day, as his fast pace and perimeter-focused approach has now become the standard in this modern league. Number 3. Jason Kidd. This 6'4" point guard was utterly mesmerizing with the basketball, as he could make specific passes with a perfect amount of spin that it would make your jaw hit the floor. He was incredible in transition and was one of the most precise and accurate lob passers in the history of basketball. He was regularly averaging high assist numbers during the lowest scoring era of modern history. In total, he led the NBA in assists per game 4 times, getting as high as 10.8 in 1999. He was the engine that drove the New Jersey Nets offense, And thanks to his solid leadership and tremendous playmaking, he was able to lead the Nets to the NBA Finals twice in the 2000s. If the fate of the universe is on the line and I have to make the most accurate pass that I can possibly make, then Jason Kidd just might be my choice. Number 2. John Stockton. To this day, this guy is still the NBA's all-time leader in total assists, and frankly, it's not even close, as he has a lead over second place that's equivalent to 5 seasons worth of leading the NBA in assists. He was never the most flashy or a highlight-worthy passer, as he loved to run the pick and roll with Karl Malone throughout the late 80s and 1990s. He wouldn't often make your jaw hit the floor with his routine yet intelligent passes, but no one could argue against its effectiveness, as Stockton led the NBA in assists per game for 9 straight seasons, from 1988 to 1996. Out of the 6 seasons with the highest assists per game average in NBA history, John Stockton has 5 of them, which is utterly insane. One of the common narratives that you hear today is that he didn't have a left hand, and to that I say, damn. He was really just that much better than almost everyone else with only his right. Before I get into the number 1 spot, here is my list of honorable mentions. Should any of these players have made the list instead, let me know below. Number 1. Magic Johnson. I can't imagine you guys being all that surprised. This man was the face of the Showtime Lakers high-octane offense in the 1980s, and in the history of basketball, no other point guard's facilitating has led to as much winning. He led the NBA in assists per game in 4 separate seasons, and to this day, he still has the highest career average in NBA history, at an amazing 11.2. You won't find a better example of a guy who made his teammates better than Magic Johnson. Sure, he had plenty of Hall of Fame talent like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and James Worthy, but even in the few instances where he didn't have the talent to support him, Magic was historically great, like in his rookie season in Game 6 of the 1980 Finals, where he won the game with his remarkable playmaking even without Kareem Abdul-Jabbar in the lineup. Or how about the 1991 Finals, where his 2 best scoring options, Byron Scott and James Worthy, were both out with an injury. Yet Magic still finished Game 5 with 20 assists, which no other player has done before in NBA Finals history. Speaking of which, of the top 5 games in Finals history with the most assists, Magic Johnson has all 5 of them. He had the averages, he had the precision, he had the vision, and he had the numbers. The only thing he really didn't have was longevity, which is fortunate for everyone else, because in that hypothetical scenario, it wouldn't have been even close. So what do you guys think? Who on the list was too high and who was too low? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Wondering, what are the 10 greatest playoff performances in NBA history? Today, I put together my list, and I'm breaking down why I believe each player has earned the spot that I placed him in. Before I get into the list, let me first explain the factors that determined my rankings. First off, the player had to win the game, so naturally, games like Michael Jordan's 63 points in Boston Garden will not be considered for this list. Second, I'm factoring in the overall production of the performance, so statistics will matter heavily. Third, I'm considering the gravity of the moment. For example, performances that took place in the first round will be considered for this list. But obviously, a player will receive extra credit if that performance came in the NBA Finals. In a similar fashion, each game within a series will be considered, but obviously a must-win Game 7 performance will earn extra credit. Lastly, how clutch the player was down the stretch will also count towards his ranking. All of these factors are subject to scale, and not every single one of these factors have to be present for each game on the list, but each one of these categories is capable of boosting a game's ranking. So now that we understand the logistics, let's get into my list, and let me know afterwards if your list differs from mine. Number 10. Bob Pettit in Game 6 of the 1958 NBA Finals versus Boston. The The Celtics legend Bill Russell won 11 championships over the course of his career as a player, but in total, he made 12 trips to the NBA Finals. The only time Russell lost on the game's biggest stage was in 1958, and it was thanks to the historic showing from the Hawks power forward Bob Pettit. He's one of the more underrated and overlooked legends of basketball history, and on this night in 1958, he outshined Russell and everyone else on the court, as he put up monstrous totals of 50 points and 19 rebounds on 55.9% shooting. Every single one of those 50 points were needed, as his St. Louis Hawks won the championship-clinching 6th game by a score of 110-109. It took everything for him to defeat the greatest winner that basketball has ever seen, and for this reason, he gets to be the one starting off my top 10 list. Number 9. Tim Duncan in Game 6 of the 2003 NBA Finals versus the Nets. The big fundamental was an absolute beast throughout the entirety of this series, but in this game especially, he destroyed the New Jersey Nets in just about every way he could. Duncan nearly had the first and only quadruple-double of NBA Finals history, as he put up an insane stat line of 21 points, 20 rebounds, 10 assists, and 8 blocks on 47.4% shooting. Despite being loaded with talent, the New Jersey Nets were only able to score a total of 77 points that evening, and that was mostly due to Duncan shutting down the paint and securing almost every rebound up for grabs. San Antonio was actually trailing by 6 points heading into the fourth quarter, but Duncan came up clutch, putting the clamps on the Nets' offense, which ultimately resulted in an 11-point championship victory for the Spurs. It was certainly one of the greatest performances by one of the greatest players to ever live. Number 8. Michael Jordan in Game 4 of the 1993 Finals versus the Suns. It was a crucial game for the Phoenix Suns, as they were looking to steal a game in Chicago and tie the series at 2 games apiece. Well, Jordan had other ideas, as MJ absolutely erupted for one of the highest scoring playoff performances of NBA history, regardless of the fact that he was being guarded by an all-defender, Dan Marley. In this iconic showing, Jordan dropped a whopping 55 points, 8 rebounds, and 4 assists on a lethal 56.8% shooting. Even with Jordan's insane level of production, the game was extremely close heading into the final few minutes, which is when MJ did what MJ does, as he sealed the game with some clutch baskets down the stretch. If MJ doesn't have the highest scoring finals average in NBA history, then the Phoenix Suns likely win this championship. But thanks to MJ's explosion, in this game especially, that didn't happen. Number 7. Giannis in Game 6 of the 2021 Finals versus the Phoenix Suns. This was recent history, so I'm sure you all know the performance very well. In a championship-clinching game, Giannis destroyed every defender Phoenix threw at him, and he was extremely efficient while doing it. On the night, the Greek Freak scored 50 points, 14 rebounds, 2 assists, and 5 blocks on a remarkable true shooting percentage of 74.9%. He was an absolute force on both ends of the court, as the Suns had basically no answer for him on either end. The game was actually tied heading into the fourth quarter, but Giannis took over as he scored 13 points in the final 10 minutes, sealing his first championship of his young career. Number 6. Elgin Baylor in Game 5 of the 1962 NBA Finals versus the Celtics. Heading into this crucial 5th game in the finals, the Boston Celtics had won the last 3 championships straight, and the series was tied at 2 games apiece. If the Lakers were going to win this important game in Boston, it was going to take a legendary performance from one of their star players. Well, to say that Elgin Baylor had a legendary performance would be an understatement, as the man recorded the highest scoring finals game in NBA history. On the evening, Baylor exploded for 61 points and a dominant 22 rebounds on 47.8% shooting. He achieved this absurd total against that season's #1 ranked defense. Thanks to his efforts, Los Angeles was able to win that pivotal 5th game with a final score of 126-121. Number 5. LeBron James in Game 6 of the 2012 East Finals versus the Celtics. This was the year following LeBron's epic meltdown in the 2011 Finals, as his Heat lost to the Dallas Mavericks. So when the Heat were yet again facing elimination, down 3-2 in the series, very few expected James to come up clutch and have a vindictive performance for the ages. But that's exactly what he did, as the King controlled the game in almost every aspect. In nearly 45 minutes of play, he poured in 45 points, 15 rebounds, and 5 assists, on a stunningly efficient 73.1% from the field. Unlike most of the other games on this list, this game wasn't close down the stretch, as LeBron scored 41 of his 45 points in the first 3 quarters, keeping Boston from ever believing they had a chance at winning that contest. Needless to say, this was the beginning of LeBron proving that he could put the Dallas series behind him and that he was more than capable of winning an NBA championship. Number 4. Michael Jordan in Game 6 of the 1998 Finals versus the Jazz. Although this is far from Jordan's best playoff game statistically, the gravity of the situation and his clutch demonstrations don't really get any better than this. On top of that, Jordan was dealing with massive obstacles. For one, Scottie Pippen's back injuries were flaring up, causing him to miss much of the game. And for the portions that Scottie actually played, he was operating as more of a decoy than anything else. Due to this, it was a requirement for Jordan to carry the offense. Not only did MJ do just that, but he did it more than anyone ever has in NBA playoff history. MJ scored 45 points, had 1 assist, and 4 steals on 42.9% shooting. Capping off his evening was arguably the most clutch sequence of all time, as Jordan stole the ball from Karl Malone and proceeded to hit a game-winning shot with 5.2 seconds remaining, which was his final shot of his career with the Bulls, and the shot that earned him his 6th championship ring. Michael scored more than half of the Bulls' total points that game, as he scored 45 of their 87 points. That's 51.7% of the team's offense. Since the NBA merger in 1976, this was the highest percentage of a team's offense in NBA Finals history. Jordan understood the magnitude of the moment, and he understood the assignment, and he delivered like only he can. Number 3. LeBron James in Game 5 of the 2007 East Finals versus the Pistons. LeBron James was only 22 years old at this point in his career, and his Cavaliers were going up against a highly favored Detroit Pistons team, who had championship experience and who had made it to the Eastern Conference Finals for the 5th straight season. The series was tied at 2 games apiece, and heading into Game 5 in Detroit, almost no one expected Cleveland to win, let alone watch a 22-year-old have one of the greatest playoff performances of all time. What LeBron proceeded to do was possibly the greatest carry job in NBA history. With 3 minutes left in the 4th quarter, LeBron completely took over the game, as he scored the Cavaliers' final 25 points of the contest. From the 2-minute and 48-second mark in the 4th quarter to the buzzer sounding in the second overtime, not a single Cavalier contributed to the final score other than LeBron James. He was 11 of 13 from the field in that stretch, and the rest of the Cavaliers were 0 of 6. Thanks to his legendary effort, the Cavs won the game, 109-107. He finished the night with 48 points, 9 rebounds, and 7 assists on 54.5% shooting. I kid you not, I was watching this game live when it took place, and this was the exact moment that I started to believe that LeBron was on his way to the GOAT conversation. Number 2. Bill Russell in Game 7 of the 1962 Finals versus the Lakers. Russell was the epitome of a clutch performer, as he played in 10 Game 7s throughout the course of his career, and he won each and every single one of them. This one, though, was certainly his best. Russell dominated on both ends of the court this night. Not only was he performing up to his usual form both defensively and on the boards, but he excelled far beyond his usual standards on the offensive end. On the night, Russell scored 30 points, snagged 40 rebounds, and had 4 assists on 44.4% shooting. To this day, his 40 rebounds in that 7th game is still the highest total in NBA Finals history. There was one other area where Bill was extremely clutch, as he made 14 of his 17 free throw attempts, which is a conversion percentage of 82.4%. He was a career 56.1% free throw shooter. If Bill doesn't step up from the free throw line on this night, his Celtics would have lost the game. Instead, he heroically led Boston to their 4th straight championship, with a final score of 110-107. When it comes to getting it done when it mattered the most, nobody did it better than Bill Russell. These are my honorable mentions for this list, and let me tell you, it was very hard to contain this list just to 10. Feel free to pause the video for a longer look. Number 1. Magic Johnson in Game 6 of the 1980 NBA Finals versus the 76ers. This was Magic Johnson's rookie season, and although the basketball world saw his potential, he was far from being the Lakers' best player throughout the season, as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar securely held that title. The problem was that in Game 5 of the Finals against the 76ers, Kareem got injured, which didn't only take him out of the rest of the game, but it forced him to sit out of Game 6 as well. With their best player and their starting center out, the Lakers were forced to look at other options to fill the center spot. What they ultimately decided was to move their starting guard, Magic Johnson, to the center position, in place of Kareem. Magic was only a 20-year-old rookie at this point, and now suddenly, the weight of the basketball season is put upon his shoulders, as he starts at a position he had never played before in the NBA. Not only did Magic not fold under the pressure, but he delivered what I believe is the greatest performance in NBA playoff history. Although Magic started at center, they moved him all over the court throughout the night to fill whatever role was asked of him. He completed the game with an astonishing total of 42 points, 15 rebounds, 7 assists, and 3 steals on a deadly true shooting percentage of 72%. With this rookie's epic performance, Magic's Lakers won the game and secured the first of his 5 championships with a final score of 123-107. When it comes to a productive showing in a crucial game with the pressure at its highest, it really doesn't get any better than this magical performance. So what do you guys think? Which game should have made the top 10? Let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.